Okay, so good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us at the Italian Cultural Institute tonight for a very special event and a very special lecture and talk. I received a phone call a few weeks ago, one morning, from a gentleman who happens to be by my side right now, who started talking about a stem and his dad. I didn't understand everything right away. When I put down the phone, I went on the internet, I Googled the story he told me about, and the whole universe literally opened in front of me, which is a fascinating story, which I'm not giving away because he will talk about it, but a fascinating story of psychiatry. I mean, I think an important aspect of the story of psychiatry in the 20th century. And that was in Chicago, right in front of my eyes, and I couldn't see it. So I was lucky enough to receive this phone call. I'm very grateful to David Arieti for being here tonight with us. I will not say anything about Silvano Arieti, because David's father, because David will talk about him. So I would like to say a couple of words about David Arieti himself. David has been involved in environmental issues for almost 40 years. He received a Bachelor of Art in Science, a major from the University of Denver, and a master's degree in Marine Science from Long Island University. He has been... You're from Long Island too?
Long Island.
Okay.
Long Island.
Wow,
not to be confused with Short Island.
For example. He has been the recipient of the Best Teacher of the Year award at Columbia College, Daly College, and Oakton Community College. He currently teaches biology and environmental science at Oakton Community College.
Two others. I teach also the other two also.
Okay,
yeah.
So they were catapulted.
Three schools, yeah.
Okay. 3 schools. In his first book, The Earth is My Patient, published in 2005, he lists the causes of environmental pollution and its effects on the planet while offering possible solutions. He is currently working on a 2nd book.
Well, I finished it.
You did? Okay.
Yeah. It's called Prognosis Disaster, the Environment, Climate Change, Human Influences, Vectors, Disease, and the Possible End of Humanity. Very optimistic title. What came out already? It's on my card.
No, I mean, when the end of humanity?
Oh, well, I don't know. It depends on Congress to give you the... it all depends on them.
Yeah, I know. That's how it goes.
We need a new one. But anyway, no politics. Yeah.
No politics. But, please welcome David Arieti with a very round of applause.
I put the other microphone right there.
Okay. And the stage is yours.
Okay, thank you. Okay, is this on? Yeah? Okay, first of all, I want to say thank you for coming. And this to me is a very moving experience that I speak, you know, people who are interested in Italian and Italy and people who were born there. Anyway, as Andre said, you know, my name is David Arieti, and I know it's an Italian name. And the reason why I'm here today, okay, is because, you know, we happen to be Italian Jews. If we weren't Jewish, we wouldn't be here today, and I'll explain the whole story to you. And anyway, so what I'm going to do today is tell you about my father. I also gave a lecture similar to this at Oakton Community College where I teach, and they asked me to speak about him, and because there was one major event that just occurred, and that was on June 28th, 2014, was the 100th anniversary of my father's birth. And when my father was born, he became one of the most prominent psychiatrists at the time, so Italy honored him with a postage stamp, a commemorative postage stamp. And so those of you, by the way, who come in late might be able to get one because I have 5 of them to raffle off here. And I will sign your name. I already put my name and the issue date, and put your name in the big, I think there was a box, and then we'll raffle them off. And so this way, I can share some of the excitement here and the thrill of being here. Anyway, so that's what started all this. And anyway, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my father's life and his works, of which you see, most of which are here, but a lot of others. He wrote articles, which I'll show you later on. And also, you also will be able to see him in action. Because I have some videos of him actually interviewing the patient and some other things that you might find interesting. Now, the videos came out in the 70s, so fortunately we still have some, and I have some with me to show you. Anyway, so let me get started. I'm going to show you an outline of what I'm going to talk about today. This is, of course, the picture I took. Let me explain something to you. I was in Italy this last October from the 5th through the 13th. So October 5th through the 13th. And there were two psychiatric organizations, the Italian Psychiatric Organization and one from America. Evidently every year they meet. And when they present papers, if they're speaking in Italian, they have, just like we have a projector, they write it in English, and if it's in English, they write it in Italian, so everybody can understand what's going on. Anyway, so what I'm going to do is, this is the outline of today's lecture, and I'll explain what's going on. And by the way, I took that picture. Of course, the most famous picture of Italy, of course, is the Leaning Tower. And I know you like the Colosseum. I myself am not too crazy about Rome because the air pollution isn't the best. I mean, it's not so good there. Pisa is a lot nicer. And by the way, I live in Niles. Guess what's in Niles? The Leaning Tower. Why? So they actually have a Leaning Tower there. And by the way, I've been in Pisa now for the last during the last 20 years for some event honoring my father. And I should point out, when I go to Pisa, you know where I stay? I stay at the Tilton Hilton. All right. Okay, why not? Okay, anyway, so I have here a whole bunch of stuff to show you about him. And anyway, first of all, a humbling experience, and I'll show you the picture of that. The house where he was born, there's something interesting about that. A street named after him. Coming to America in a boat, marriage to my mother, my father, his father, and me in a special picture. The Parnassus house, this has a lot of significance, I'll explain that. Him standing in front of his diplomas, his honors degrees, his books and articles, important cases he was on, and then Peter, Paul, and Mary, and you'll see why I have that too. I'm sure most of you know who they were, and it's quite interesting. And all this, you know, I am lucky to be his son, and you know, I take pleasure in being that, and so I'm glad I can share my good fortune with you all. Now, let's see if this works here. If it doesn't work, hold on. We got here, I know it worked. Let's try it again. I have to go on this side. Let's see. Oh, wonder. Paste, turn it on. When in doubt, turn it on. Okay, there we go. Okay, there is me. Now, let me explain what this picture is. When I arrived in Pisa on October 5th, the 6th was the day of the first meeting. So there I am, I was walking on the side of the Yarrow River. Pisa is divided up with 4 bridges in the Yarrow River. You have 2 sides. And the meeting, the first day of the meeting was held in this building. So I'm walking along, ready to go to the meeting, and sure enough, I see they put a picture of my father there. So I said, well, I couldn't miss a picture of me standing there. So I find this very humbling in that, you know, I go to the meetings and I see his picture there and I had to take my picture. But to me, this really was a heartwarming event. And this fellow, his name is Luca. He's also a psychiatrist. He's a young psychiatrist as well. And over here, this was the stamp that they honored him with. And I'll go more into that later. And I just made one big stamp, and then I have the little ones there. And this picture was actually photographed by my brother, but my father was reading a different book that he wrote. It was called Creativity, the Magic Synthesis, of which I have a copy here as well, and I'll show you that later. But what they did was they photoshopped this book, Interpretation of Schizophrenia, the 2nd edition. And the reason why they did that one, I have it right here, because in 1975 that won the National Book Award for Science. And I think Carl Sagan, you know, the famous astronomer, was one of the 3 people on the committee. So again, I feel honored, you know, of all these events and with his intellectual capability. Now, there is also a web page that Italy designed for him. I have it here, and then you can get it to find out more information. I'll just click on it in a moment. Okay, anyway, I guess we have no internet. But there's a web page called silvanoarieti.it. The IT stands for Italy, and you can get all the information I'm telling you now, basically, except the pictures. And they also have the celebration of the stamp. It's a 2.5-hour presentation where they're all talking in Italian. You can get it on YouTube, except you just go to this web page, put in stamp, and it's all spoken in Italian, but you know, it's nice to listen to Italian whether you understand it or not. I don't understand. I speak a good broken Spanish and Hebrew, but anyway, this is a significant picture. There's me with a picture of my father, and this is also something significant, and I'll explain why. When my parents were growing up, they lived in a house, an apartment house, and the apartment house was actually bought by, when my father and his parents died, by one of my father's, let's put it this way, first loves. There was this woman that fell in love with him, and she married somebody else, and she became a widow, and when the house was for sale when my father was born, she bought it, and then she died. And what happened was, when she died, they donated the house to the Jewish congregation. And what they would do with his house, they would have people who have mental illness live in the house. And there was a restaurant in which people with the mental illness who lived in the house would work, you know, something like a therapy. So this was right outside the door of the restaurant where the people with mental problems would work, you know. And we met one of the women who worked there, and she lived in the house that used to belong to my father. So my brother and I, you know, we wanted the house to be useful for something, so they donated it to the synagogue, the one synagogue in Pisa, which got involved with this organization, the Italian Psychiatric Organization, and now they use it to house people with mental problems, which I think is nice. So anyway, that's right outside the restaurant. Now, this is the street where my father was born. It's called Sant Andrea Street. And this is actually the basis of one of my father's books called The Parnasse, which was based on the horrific events of the end of World War II, thanks to the Nazis. Now, my father lived in one of these houses, and the Parnasse lived in the other. Who is the Parnasse? The Parnasse was the general word for a person who was the president of the Jewish congregation there. They called him the Parnasse. His name was Giuseppe Pardo Rocca. Okay, and so they called him the Parnasse just for short. And anyway, so my father wrote the book about it. Now, I'll go more into that later. This is the plaque they placed on the wall of my father's house, okay? And this is the one I just photographed recently while I was there in October. And I'll translate this. It's nice. See, this is how much they thought of him. And for me, it's a real humbling experience because they really liked him. And I'll show you who was really responsible for all this later on. Anyway, I'm going to translate what this says to you. It's obviously, you can't read it now, but I have it in the next picture there. Oh, wait. There. Okay, I'll go back in a moment. I'll translate this for you. I'll go back. This is the picture, okay, of that. And this is the translation. And then I'll go back to his birth. In this house, Silvano Arieti was born on June 28, 1914. He received his medical doctorate degree in Pisa in 1936, forced to leave Italy because of the racial laws, and I'll explain that. He went to the United States where he became the most famous psychiatrist of his time because of his contribution to the knowledge of schizophrenia and depression. Scientists and humanists and interpreted the brutal Nazi massacre in Sant Andrea Street. He died August 7, 1981. The city of Pisa placed his plaque for everlasting memory 20 years after his death. So, what was the Nazi brutality there? What they did was, and this is all written in the book, The Parnasse, and I'll explain that. What happened was, the Parnasse had a mental illness. You see how everything sort of fits into place. My father decided, he became a psychiatrist, and he realized the Parnasse, Giuseppe Pardo Rocca, had a mental illness. What was his illness? His illness was he would be walking and he would pretend to see animals, dogs and things like this. And he would walk with a cane and he'd say, "Get away, get away, get away." So evidently he hallucinated these things, and evidently my father interpreted this as some sort of mental illness. Now, come World War II, okay? Now, being the Parnas, the president of the Jewish congregation, he would invite people over to his house for dinner, whether they were Jews or not. So what happened was, when the Nazis came, on their side of the Yarrow River, I should point out, remember I said the Yarrow is divided up into two parts, the Germans destroyed the 4 bridges. On the other side of the Yarrow, about 300 miles away, were the American army. Of course, they couldn't cross the river. And so my father wrote what he perceived was the last 2 weeks of the life of the Parnas. Now, remember a few seconds ago I told you that the Parnas would invite people over. So, the Parnas, Giuseppe Racas, he also invited some Christians to stay with him. He couldn't leave his house. He didn't want to leave because his mental illness prevented him from leaving. So he was able to stay with some senior citizens, and they all stayed with him. And actually there's a plaque across the street on his house too, which I will show you at the end. I have that at the end. And anyway, the end result was, it was a few weeks, I think, before the end of the war, and the Nazis just killed everybody in the house. And, you know, it's a terrible event, but my father, he kind of writes in a beautiful way, because before he became a psychiatrist, he actually wanted to become a playwright. And so, anyway, that's another thing that he was able to do. So he was really a nice writer. Anyway, I want to show you this. Now, what's the Archduke Ferdinand have to do with this? Well, very interesting. Okay, my father was born June 28th. What else happened June 28th? The Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria was shot the same day, which precipitated World War I. And another coincidence. His assassination in Sarajevo, which means it's part of the Bosnian, I guess, or the former Yugoslavia, precipitated Austria-Hungary's declaration of war against Serbia. This caused the Central Powers, including Germany and Austria-Hungary, and Serbia's allies to declare war on each other. This is something to war, something I'm just trying to, kind of hard to deal with in general. But anyway, I should say one more thing about my father's birth. He almost was not born alive. He was telling me that he was a breached birth. And I think the doctors were ready to give up when he just turned, and the rest is history. That actually, he told me about it, my father. I guess his mother told him, I don't remember. But anyway, now, there's the street named after him. That's me. I dress for the occasion. There's my brother. My brother doesn't look anything like me. He looks like our mother. I look like our father. So all we have, I just have one brother, and he's got one brother too. What a coincidence. So, anyway, and so there's me. Like I say, I dress in shorts. Hey, it was real hot in October there. Anyway, so he's my father. I mean, my brother, by the way, teaches Greek and Latin at a Hampton-Sydney college in Virginia. His field is ancient Greek. He's got one problem though. It's very difficult to find ancient Greeks walking the streets to practice with. Okay, well, it's true. All right, now, in 1938, he came to America. Whoops. Anyway, this one always jumps. He came to America in the Queen Mary, okay? And this is 1938. And what happened was, the day he graduated medical school, they said, well, I think it was Mussolini said, Jews can't practice medicine in Israel, in Italy, amongst other things. The day he graduated, that's what he told me. That's a hell of a graduation gift, right? So of course he had to manage to get out of Italy, which was not easy. He couldn't just hop on a boat and take off. And I believe the story of his escape, he pretended to go skiing in Switzerland. And he went through Switzerland, and then he got to America by boat because he had an aunt there who was here. And she evidently had enough money at the time to take care of him. I think he was able to get a visa. In those days, I'm not sure how they worked it, but it was probably a lot easier in those days than these days. And I'll tell you who's who here that I remember. Now, I'm not sure if that's my father's brother. He had one brother that could be him. His brother's name was Giulio. There's my father. these two people, this is Enrico and Mana, his aunt and uncle, and these are their two kids, Giulio and Jackie. And their last name was Bemperod. Giulio became a psychiatrist like my father, and he and my father participated in one book called the Severe and Mild Depression. Giulio has died a number of years ago, I believe, of lung cancer. But Jackie Bemperod is now a rabbi, and he's in his 80s, and he still practices at a congregation in New Jersey. So he became a prominent rabbi, and I don't know which is which. I don't know which is which here. One of these two kids. I think that's Giulio, and I think that looks more like Jackie, but it doesn't matter. And anyway, so that's the case. So they're over there on the Queen Mary, and look at that, must have been Passover time. Look, Manischewitz, matzah. There's an interesting story about matzah. You know, I went to the University of Denver, as Andrea said, and one day it was Passover. So I go, this is a true story, I go to one of these ma and pa stores. I said, do you have any matzahs? He says, yeah, in the corner. So what do you think he showed me? A bunch of matches. And that's a true story. So since that really happened, but anyway, you know, he didn't understand. That was in Denver. It really happened. Okay, now, there's my mother, and he got married December 14th, 1941, was my mother, and she unfortunately died of ovarian cancer in 1978. But something interesting about that, you know, my daughter was born on August 24th, and that's the same date as my mother's birthday. So I thought that was coincidence, and maybe not. You know, maybe up there my mother, you know, anything's possible. I mean, really, I believe that. But anyway, so there's my mother, and she was teaching, she became a science teacher in a high school.
Was she American?
Yeah, she was born in New York, but her mother was from, her father was from New York, and her mother was from Kiev. So she was part Russian. The best that I remember, that's the case. There is my grandfather. That's my, this is my father's father. There's my father. Guess who this cute kid is. I think I'm less cute now, but anyway. There's my father with his diplomas, and he's got quite a few. He won quite a number of awards, and what I'm going to do is show you a whole potload of his works now. But anyway, this last picture is the one of the house across the street from my father's house where the Parnasse lived. And this told a little bit of the story. I really should get the translation of it. I don't have that, but what they did was they listed the names of the non-Jews living in the house with him there, who died that fateful night. I think it was in August of 1944, or it must have been 45. I should have gotten the translation, but I didn't think about it. Okay, now what I want to do is show you a whole list of his works, and I have those here as well. And let me get those up. Okay, there it is. Let's see here. Now, he was quite a prolific writer. He would spend about 8 hours a day in his office, and I'll explain to you what killed him. Okay, he died in 1981 of a lung cancer. Okay, now, he didn't smoke, or maybe he smoked a little bit. It seemed to me he smoked, but I don't know. I don't think that's what killed him. Now, hold on a second. Blow this up here. Just a second. I have to get the right one. Yeah, these are his books. Hold on a second. Let me blow this up a second. One thing about the computers, you can blow stuff up without dynamite. So that's, hold on a second. Let's do this. There we go. Okay. Now, let me continue. Get back down here. I have a whole couple of stuff trying to get this to work properly from back to hassle. Now, these are his books he wrote. He wrote Interpretation of Schizophrenia. He wrote, oh wait, you can't see it here. Hold on. I have up. This also will be a problem sometime. There we go. Duplicate. Yep. Okay. We can see some of his books. I will go into them. He wrote The Interpretation of Schizophrenia in 1955, the first edition, which I have here. And let me tell you about this book. This is real interesting for the following reason. He wanted to get it published, so he was looking for a publisher. Remember, this is 1955, so he was looking for a publisher. And no one would publish it. So finally he found Basic Books. But the publisher told him, he said, look, I will publish this book if you buy a couple thousand copies. So he said, okay, I'll do it. So sure enough, they published the book. I guess months go by or something. Then all of a sudden, Rosenthal, he's the hero of this, he was the publisher. He comes knocking on my father's door in the office. He says, quick, give me back all your books. We have too much of a demand for them. So my father sold them back, and ever since then, whatever he published whatever he wrote got published. So again, that was quite interesting. Huh? Yes. So that's what that really got him going. It sounds like a fairy tale movie, you know, but these things happen. Okay. Then he wrote. This is the translation of the Manual of Psychiatry. That's the Italian translation of the American Handbook of Psychiatry. I have 4 out of the 7 volumes here. He was responsible for 7 volumes. He didn't write it. He was the editor of those, you see. So he was the editor of those. So when he wrote a few articles in each, so he was the editor-in-chief, and the Italian translation, again, is Manual of Psychiatry. I saw them in Italy, the actual manual. I don't have a copy of that. And then he wrote the Intrapsychic Self, which is this one here. It's Feeling, Cognition, and Creativity in Health and in Mental Illness. And then the World Biennial of Psychiatry, that's a number of papers in here. He edited this one. There are actually 2 volumes of this one. And then he wrote The Will to be Human. That's this one here. The Will to be Human. You can all take a look at these later. And then he wrote, well, the other edition of the volumes didn't all come out at once. All 7 volumes of the American Handbook, they came out individually after a few years, each one. Let's see what we have. And then Interpretation of Schizophrenia, the 2nd edition, which won the National Book Award. That is this one. Here. Doesn't matter. That's this one right here. And you can all look at these. This is the 2nd edition that won the National Book Award. It's right there. And that was in '75. And then New Dimensions in Psychiatry. That has 2 editions. I just bought one because it's a real schlep getting them here. This is one of the 2 volumes, volume 2. And so I must admit, he was prolific. And then one of his terrific books was Creativity, The Magic Synthesis, which I have 1 hardcover and 1 soft cover right here. This one, I think they were using it at Columbia University. And sometimes we get requests for publishers to use chapters in his books. Of course, we sign. You know, I'm not interested in making money off of his books. We just signed a contract in Italy for books, but, you know, we just gave it to him. We don't want money because, you know, that would be sort of a disservice, you know. And I feel honored, my brother and myself, we just signed these contracts that we don't want anything, donate the money to the Jewish Congregation and Psychiatric Organization because those people need it more than we do. And then, let's see here, I have a lot of interesting stories about these books. And then Severe and Mild Depression, he wrote that with his cousin, Jules Bemperad, who I mentioned previously. And evidently it's still good, some of these books. This is called a psychotherapeutic approach to severe and mild depression. And let's see. Okay, here's another volume he wrote, volume 7 of the American Handbook of Psychiatry. Let's keep going here. And then another one that I mentioned, the Intrapsychic Self, yeah. Okay, let me see, we gotta go back down. And then New Dimensions. Oh, Love Can Be Found. That's another book he wrote together with my brother. Like I said, my brother is a classicist. He teaches English, Greek, and Latin. That's this one here. And let's see. Oh, the Parnasse. Now, the Parnasse was probably the most translated book of all of his. And this tells you the story of the leader of the Jewish congregation during the last 2 weeks of his life. And unfortunately, he was murdered along with his other residents of the house just for just being there, essentially.
Could you tell us that story?
What's that?
Could you tell us that story about the people that got killed along with the Parnasse?
Well, I don't know much about them. I think they were Christians. Now, why do I say Christians? Because, you know, this was the war with the Jews and non-Jews, and that's the only thing I remember, that the Parnasse, I read it, I think I read it twice. The Parnasse himself would invite people to the house, and these Christians didn't want to leave either. You know, maybe in the state of war, you'd think you'd want to escape, but for some reason they didn't, and he couldn't leave because his mental illness kept him there. That's what actually was responsible for his death at the end. He couldn't get away. You know, mentally, he didn't want to leave the house.
Was he killed because he was Jew?
Well, most likely, but they killed the Christians. I don't think it mattered. They were just there in his house. Maybe because they were in a Jewish house, they all got to go. That was my impression. Try reading the book. It's good. And by the way, I buy them myself. I give them away because I buy them on Amazon. The books cost a penny, but you pay $4 for shipping, but who cares? I buy them and I give them away, and you can get them on Amazon in the library too. Here, I'll show you the issues. We have one, the English book. We have it in Japanese, so if anybody wants to brush up on their Japanese, there's one there. We have it in Italian. Now that one, of course, would be good here.
You have one in Hebrew.
Yes, we have it in Hebrew too. It's in Hebrew. This one, yeah, that one, I'll pick it up. This one's the Parnasse in Hebrew. And then there was a fellow named Paul Dry. Who was Paul Dry? Paul Dry is a publisher who realized that since the Parnasse was out of print and no longer publishable, he decided to print it and publish it himself. So he developed, he fell in love with the book. He used to belong to the book company called Bedrock Books, but evidently there was another company called Bedrock. So now his book company is called Paul Dry Books. So he reprinted this book. There's only one thing different. Well, there's the main difference between this soft-cover book and the original hardcover is he didn't put in any pictures in here, okay? The hardcover, the original book written in English, by the way, remember my father's native language was Italian, but he wrote everything in English. The original book has pictures of Pisa, and they also have an article of the New York Times, from the New York Times, mentioning that the Americans went to Pisa and all this. So this book has all the everything written except the pictures. I think it would be better to get the hardcover. And, anyway, you still get it really inexpensively on the internet. Now, I did have a copy here of the Parnasse. I thought I brought it here. So I did have it. I'll find it. I have so many here that, oh, here it is. Yeah, here it is. This was the one this was the hardcover, and this has all the pictures in it. For some reason, Paul Dry didn't put the pictures. Maybe that has to do with copyright or something like this. Okay. Oh, by the way, here too, in this list, they give you his books translated, also from English. And then, what else we have? Okay, but the other, volume 7, let's see what else we have here. And then, he wrote articles, okay? I'm not going to go over all the articles, but I'll just show you from when he wrote, and then I have some more interesting stuff. I know this stuff gets, I don't want to bore you too much with this, but his first article came out in 1941 called Histopathological Changes in Experimental Metrazole Convulsions in Monkeys, okay? Now, you know, that probably doesn't mean much, but it's from the American Journal of Psychiatry. And then, I'm going to go down. Now, he's written over 100 articles, so they put his whole bibliography together here. These are all the articles he was responsible for. And there's one in particular that I think you should be aware of more than any other. because in 1960, they asked him to write the article in Encyclopedia Britannica about psychosis. And let me see if I get it here. See, he wrote all these articles. I think it was in 1960. Anyway, it's here somewhere. Can you see it? Which one is it? This one?
1960.
This one?
Below. The last 1960.
Oh, right there. This one? Oh, yeah. Encyclopedia Britannica, right. So he wrote that in 1960. And so I felt down here. I was in high school at the time. Anyway, yeah, there it is. And then the rest, these are all other articles. They were in the Journal of Psychiatry, Psychotherapy of the Psychosis, although that was in basic books. Anyway, Comparative Psychiatry. There's so many magazines, journals relating to psychiatry. When I was in graduate school in the 70s, as Andre said, I got my degree in marine science. There were 10,000 scientific journals. Can you imagine? 10,000. Now, I don't know how many there are. But, you know, they cover every aspect of science, whether it's, you know, DNA and cancer and, you know, marine organisms, algae. There's even the American Mycological Society. By the way, something real interesting. My main field is phycology. Phycology is the study of algae. I know it sounds like psychology. That's where my father was involved. Phycology is where we're in. So anyway, that's what I wanted to show you about his work here. So he was quite prolific, and again, it doesn't end. It ends way down till, I think it was, so like I say, he died in 81. There's actually an article in 1982, but that one was evidently published. Well, he wrote it before he passed away. And again, he had a strange lung cancer. Let me tell you what happened, why he died, okay? I think it's coincidence that my field is environmental science and you know, health of the environment. Now, I'm also a member of the American Academy of Environmental Medicine. Even though I'm not a doctor, I've been a member since 1979. And what this organization deals with is people who are who get exposed to chemicals and then they react. Simple stuff like even carpets, new carpets, perfume, things like this make people sick. So what happened was when my father died, like I say, he had a strange lung cancer. We went into the room. He bought an apartment to see patients, okay? And he would have the room where he would see patients in the window facing 74th Street, between Park Avenue and Lexington in New York. Across the street, when he bought the apartment, they were building a synagogue. They were making a lot of noise. So what my father did was he had it insulated with some sort of caulking material. Just the room where he would see the patients. So, after he died, we shut the door, my brother and myself and some other people were in his office, and I said, boy, it's pretty stuffy in here. And, you know, I couldn't believe it. It was like no oxygen. It was pretty stuffy. Now, my father would be in that office 12 hours a day, including Sundays. You know, he would see patients and he would also write. Obviously, you know, if he has, he's so prolific, you know, he spends all his time writing. And anyway, we went in there and it was stuffy, so he developed some form of lung cancer, which I'm sure was a result of that, because that's the type of work I'm involved with. You know, I deal with, you know, environmental illness and stuff like this. So, yes, because it was some caulk material, but you know, I don't know what could have been in it.
Asbestos.
I doubt that. No, it was against sound. Asbestos is for heat. You know, that's to retain the heat. I don't know, there was something there. Maybe it was a mixture. Could have been formaldehyde for all I know, you know, because that is found in these trailers. But anyway, so that's what killed him. Now, I want to show you a few other things of interest that have to do with my father and myself. Something real interesting. A number of years ago, I was teaching at Truman College, and they were having a book sale. Now, incredible thing happened. There was this girl. She went to the book sale and she showed me the book she got. The name of the book was, for $1, she picked it up. It's called Psychopathology, the Science of Understanding Deviance. So I said, let me look at it. And sure enough, what do I see? Picture of my father in there. So, there he is, right there. So I said, well, let me buy the book back from you. How much was it? She says, $1, but I'll give it to you. I said, well, I'll just pay $1. This way you're not out anything. So this was really an interesting experience, you know. Here was a girl, she picked up the book for the rummage sale, and here's my father. So I said, okay, that's interesting, but now it even gets better. How many of you have seen the movie Takebacks? Remember any? Okay, what's Takebacks? Takebacks was with one of the Bridges brothers. I forget which one, Jeff or the other one. Anyway, he plays a psychiatrist. And the story is from a guy named Gene Brewer, okay? So I was teaching at Wabansi. Yes, I teach at a number of schools. One semester I was teaching at 6 schools. Now I'm only down to 3. But anyway, I really enjoy being part-time. I have more fun at it. I do. Anyway, so I was speaking to another teacher, and he said, is your father Silvano Arieti? I said, yes. How do you know? He says, well, he just read the book Takebacks. And my father's name is mentioned in it. So, okay, so he shows me the book, and I'll read it to you. It's in the very beginning of the book. Here's the book. You know, sometimes books have little blurbs. I'll read it to you. It says, when we successfully treat a patient, we experience a burst of joy because we have helped a suffering person who is happy to have known us. But we also feel a secret joy because we have come to know him, and in knowing him, we know more of ourselves. So it's signed Silvano Arieti. So he actually took it from one of my father's books. And so what happened was, I think it was from the Father Shores of Psychiatry book. So I wanted to get in touch with Gene Brewer. It even gets better. Okay. So I look up in the phone book. I couldn't find him. Now, when I was at Truman College, also, I've been there a lot, I was teaching in the middle college. I was co-teaching with a woman named Ann. And I just happened to mention to Ann, you know, I'm trying to get a hold of this guy, Gene Brewer. And she says she knows him because he's a friend of the family's. So she got me his phone number. I called him up. He was happy to hear from me. I told him who I was, and he sent me a copy of the book. And he also sent me another copy of the second book called On a Beam of Light. It continues the story of Takebacks. And then he sent me another copy by email of a book, the third one called Return to Takebacks. And essentially what the story is about, it's about a person who wakes up and believes he's from another planet called Takebacks. And it was played by Kevin Spacey. Now, in the movie, it's quite interesting. He plays a guy from space, Spacey, maybe some coincidence there. Anyway, that's what the movie was about. It was pretty well done. And when I read the book, I thought the New York Psychiatric Hospital really existed. So I tried looking at it in the phone book, and I called up the operator. It didn't exist. So then, you know, because I thought it was real, because I had no way of knowing. I mean, you know, people can imagine all sorts of things. And in this case, it's not really too strange that this person named Prote was from another planet. You know, he said he was anyway. Anybody can say that. But anyway, if I were nasty, I'd say, look at Congress. I think we should send them there. Here somewhere, but that's another story. Just a quick note. What's the opposite of progress? Congress. Just all right. Anyway. All right. Now, thank you. By the way, I do not like political jokes. And I joke a lot, and that, the reason is because too many get elected. We'll stop there. All right. Now, all right, let's continue. All right. Now, well, actually, I do that too. All right. Now, what I want to do is, I forgot to mention one more thing, or two more things. The interpretation of schizophrenia, by the way, was translated to Japanese also. So the Parnas was listed there. Evidently, maybe the Japanese have a lot of psychiatric cases, because I'll tell you a story too about my father in Japan. He was invited to give a lecture in Japan. Now, he really lucked out. I'll tell you what happened. He got to the airport early, real early, because they told him he needed a visa to go there. And the people who invited him didn't tell him he needed a visa. So he was telling me. Fortunately, he arrived real early. So what he did was he took a cab to the Japanese consulate, back from the airport, Kennedy Airport. He made it. They gave him a visa. He went back to the airport and was able to go. So, you know, he was lucky. He really arrived early. I said, why do you arrive early? He says, because just in case, you know, there's traffic or something. So he really lucked out. I guess it was the middle of the week where, sometime when there wasn't a lot of traffic, Because I'll tell you this, I got stuck in traffic a half hour to get here, just a few blocks. I had to schlep all these books. Now, there is one other thing, a couple other things I want to mention. My father was involved with some famous cases. The most famous of which was the Boston Strangler. I don't know if you ever remember him. Albert DeSalvo was the person who they believed was the Boston Strangler. And I think Bailey, F. Lee Bailey, the other guy who got involved with the O.J. Simpson trial, was the lawyer for DeSalvo. I believe that was the case. And my father was arguing with him about keeping Albert DeSalvo and studying him and all this. And I think Bailey said no, there was some sort of dispute about it. But anyway, these things happen. So that was one case he was on. And one of the most important things, too, that I want to mention, too, other than his cases, is that he became friends with Peter Yarrow. Now, I don't know if you know who Peter Yarrow is. He's the Peter of Peter, Paul, and Mary. And Peter, Paul, and Mary are very creative. And my father, of course, he was creative, too. And they founded a society together called the Creative Foundation. Now, I've been trying to look it up, but I don't see it anymore. But what I wanted to do was to play a little blurb with you in which Peter was actually in his house playing for my father and his second wife and some other guests. So I just have a little bit of it here. And then there was one other thing I should share with you. Yeah.
Dr. Arieti. Silvano Arieti.
That's Peter. I just thought I'd play a little bit of it for you. And then I'll answer some questions. So I feel honored, you know. I'm just his son. I just enjoy the fruits of his labor, you might say. I'll just play a little bit of this. So, this was to Peter Yarrow. By the way, you know, Mary died a few years ago. And I did see them at the Carnegie Hall. In fact, there's another story about Carnegie Hall I should share with you. One day, I'm walking down the street, 59th Street, and a person from Germany comes along and says, can you tell me how to get to Carnegie Hall? I said, yeah, practice. Yeah, right. All right. Now, anyway, okay. So, anyway, so I think I gave you a pretty good story now about him, and here I put on my computer the stamp. Now, what I want to do today, those of you who came late, I want you to fill out these, and I'm going to give 5 stamps away. If you put your name, we'll put them in the box, and we'll draw them out. Good. Whoever didn't get one, put your name. We have the box, and we'll let Joe, you want to draw them for me? Here's my friend. By the way, this is Joe Okafor. He teaches with me at Columbia. And he gave a lecture today at Oakton, too, about the Jews of Africa. So, quite interesting. Here. Yeah, I didn't even know they were Jew. I didn't know they had them there until Joe mentioned. Yeah. All right, put your names on. I think we have a box around here somewhere. And by the way, you're welcome to come on up and look at the books. Now, let me tell you about myself a little bit. As Andre said, right now I'm an adjunct professor of environmental science and biology, and I wrote 2 books on the environment. And my main field is trying to save the earth. I know that's a big wish, but I do a lot. I give lectures, I raise hell, because you got to. You can't just sit there and accept everything. And so I'm glad I'm able to do it. Oh yeah, go pass these around. All right, where's the box? Are we all out of paper?
No, I still have some.
Oh, good. Well, by the way, I'm sure many of you know Dario, right?
Why? Oh, no, I am the one who translated.
Oh, you translate. He teaches. We taught together at Columbia, too.
The day I met this guy, he came into my office with a photograph of that steel on the walls of Pisa. And you asked me to translate.
Right, yeah.
You remember?
Yeah, of course. So I know Dario, I think you're president of this organization, right? What else? Yes?
Was Yarrow imaging available when your father?
That's a good question. I'm not so sure. That was like, wait a minute, let me think. I think they did have the Catscan at the time. Now, I'm not sure if they had that advanced, but the Catscans existed in the 70s, I believe, right? That was the computerized axial tomography, and that's where you can see inside the body, I believe. Oh, I know what I forgot. I want to show you some movies of my father interviewing the students. I think we'll do that first. I knew I forgot something. This is more important. And I meant to show you this, I just forgot. I get carried away, and I hope we're not running out of time.
No, we're fine.
Did he do electroshock?
Yes, he did do electroshock, and he had a machine in his office. And yeah, let me get this. And I'm going to show you.
Using it today.
I don't know if they use that anymore, do they?
They use it today. It's much more sophisticated than it used to be, and it is not considered an abusive practice at all.
Along the same lines, did he use chemicals?
Oh,
Because I
drugs?
don't know, when did the pharmacology enter psychiatry?
Oh,
It's
that
not
I don't
about
know.
medication.
It's a good question.
Did he use
Dario.
Okay, we'll go and ask now, and then we'll show my father in action. I know I forgot something, I just got carried away here. Okay, go ahead, this one.
Yeah, I want to, yeah, you hear me? I want to know, when did pharmacology enter psychiatry?
Oh, I have no idea. That, I have
And
no
if
idea.
your dad used it,
Yeah,
pioneered it?
oh, that's a good question, because, wait, in his second book, Interpretation of Schizophrenia, he does mention drugs available. So,
Actually, in the 70s.
70s, that's what I thought. Yeah, I don't know the details of the medical aspects of it.
Psychoactive drugs have been used at least since the 50s.
Okay, so it was...
I'm a toxicologist.
Okay, now, what I'm going to do is, I knew I had something else to show you. I was getting so excited to be here that I got, okay, actually, fortunately, we had videos in the 70s, so we're actually going to see a few of my father in action here. He's videotaping a girl who had catatonic schizophrenia, and if you know what that is, that's where I think you just stay like a statue, okay? Catatonia, and he kind of treated her, and you'll see a couple of him interviewing this. Now, what they did was, my brother, he cut this up into pieces because it was too much to put in one piece. So we'll watch my father here interviewing this.
I've seen that.
That's him there.
I knew that you were in contact with me. And as a matter of fact, I felt that this contact later on was
Did you make it louder?
and so
Yeah.
that we could eventually communicate.
Yeah.
Could you explain?
Yeah.
Really
It's loud.
gave you the strength, the ability, the nerve, I don't know, to
Yes,
talk
as loud
to
as
me.
I
I
can
mean,
get it.
what was it about you that made me trust you and that made me have confidence in
Well,
you?
put it that way if you want. Yes, what informed you from a person?
I don't know, it seems to me that you're very kind, very compassionate man, something about your face, maybe it's your eyes, I don't know. And my parents would take me to
Cover her
the
face.
office, to the hospital, and the atmosphere of the office was so accommodating and so warm and so nice. And I don't know, it was just something, a total feeling of comfort and confidence that I felt when I was in your presence that made me confide in you.
And what about the other doctors in the hospital?
No, I didn't like the doctor that I had in the hospital. He would come and talk to me for 3 minutes, and it would be a 1, 2, 3 affair, and I couldn't even talk, and he talked so fast to me. He would ask me questions, and I'd hardly have a chance to answer before he asked me the next question. He said, well, I'll see you tomorrow, Marie, I'll see you tomorrow. And it seemed that I could never communicate with him. He was good about drugs and administering pharmaceutical remedies to me, but he wasn't a psychiatrist. My God, he was a monster.
Yeah. So anyway, we have a few of these. Might as well show you what I have here. Yes, she said he was a monster. So, well, okay. Here's another one. I think he's interviewing the same girl. She's a 19-year-old girl at the time.
Marie?
Yes?
We're here again. We have seen the videotape which was made 6 weeks ago.
Yes.
And I was quite moved.
So was I.
It was quite an exciting speech.
Yes.
I think that I asked you many questions, and the way you answered really made me feel once more how you felt about certain things which are so important, so important in your life. And yet, it seems to me, I forgot to ask you some important questions at that time, which I would like to ask you now. I remember the beginning when you were very sick, when I came to see you in the hospital, when you couldn't move, when you were like a piece of marble, like a statue, you couldn't do it. You told me that you were aware, however, that possibly you could move. You could move, and yet you didn't dare to move. Could you explain to me why couldn't you move at all?
Well, it was a very strange feeling, and I now still have a very vague recollection of how the whole thing occurred. But it seemed to me that if I tried to move, lifting my head was painful in itself. I felt as if my circle, my halo, had been taken off my head. And then it was wrong for me to bring my head up, and it was very painful. I thought that, in other words, I would disrupt the order of the universe if I moved my body.
It has the power to disrupt.
Yeah, it's wrong.
The movement do that.
I don't know, it's wrong. I guess it was out of the sense of guilt that I had over the whole thing that happened.
A movement that has a cosmic aspect.
Yes, it was so universal, as if my movements would determine the course of the future and of the rest of the world. It was insane.
In other words, that it was in your power to change the order of the universe, or to be able to disrupt the order of the universe.
So that it was wrong for me to move.
I see.
So here we have a couple more if you want. I have him being interviewed by another psychiatrist. They're talking about her case. Conversation, this guy, Dr. Berger. Are you interested in this?
Yeah.
So he's a doctor they're talking about here now. I'm sorry for I can't make it louder, it's as loud as I can get.
Arieti questions to clarify his theoretical premises and his way of working with people called schizophrenia. Silvano, this young woman is most interesting, and her situation a little more different than many of the patients who we see and we diagnose as schizophrenic. And she's come a long way in 7 months. Could you share with us what went on between you? What happened? How did this come about?
2 different processes go on at the same time, and we have to explain them separately. I mean, an interpersonal process and an intrapsychic process. Both of them have to resolve themselves in a successful way in order to obtain the result that we have achieved. Now, interpersonal, there is certain things that happen in the treatment of the psychotic which we cannot translate well in scientific language, at least today. But as soon as I saw this girl who could not move in the hospital, I didn't fully respond to her as to a specimen, a clinical specimen, but a vibrant human being. I somehow sensed that inside her immobility there was a volcano of emotions that she could not.
Was she a rigid type of classical catatonic?
But she could drop to the floor if you would let her.
This is for most therapists, particularly new psychiatrists and other therapists, this moment is a very difficult one about how you establish a relationship with a person who makes themselves appear to be an object that is rigid, stiff, serioflexibilitas, or whatever, just they're standing there like a statue.
Many beginners assume that the catatonic patients completely separated from the rest of the universe. Well, this is a fallacy.
They talk in front of them like they don't hear.
Because as a matter of fact, they are, the perception in many cases is sharp. They are able to repeat everything that the therapist does.
10 and 20 years
The
before.
only thing is that they cannot respond. The facial expression does not exist. There is no emotion. It seems as if they have really lost capacity to respond. In general, is a generalized response, a state of panic, as Marie herself told us. She attributed to any movement a cosmic need. She was afraid that if she would move, she would disrupt the order of the universe.
Like the whole world would fall over?
Yes, because, and she generalized this feeling to any movement. This is hard for us to understand, but it is not. If we realize that she had a tremendous feeling of guilt for her actions, and her guilt was extended to any emotion of her body. Therefore, it would be only the immobility which would reveal, which would relieve her of this tremendous feeling of guilt, which was as intense as the passion that she had had for this man before. The immobility would not allow her to think again, because any action that she would perform would still be connected with the sense of guilt.
It's so fascinating. It's like animals in the wood when they're frightened and panicky and fear attack or whatever, that they become still. They freeze.
Yes, but however, there's a big difference, because in this case, the fear is of the patient's own actions, or what, in this case, she could do, because her actions were sinful. This is a primitive generalization.
Right.
Of course, the sin existed in her mind only, and was originated an account of the relation that she had with this young man. I felt this tremendous feeling of empathy for her, and a strong desire to help her, a strong desire to reach, and my certainty that she would understand me in spite of the fact that she was not able to respond.
I'll finish this. I just want to tell you what they're talking about. This comes from, we'll continue with this. This will be another couple of minutes. What happened was this young girl, she fell in love with a priest. That's part of her problem afterwards. And this is what they're talking about. So when they mentioned this young man, you know, he came from another country. He wasn't American, and then he left her. And so this is what he's talking about, because the other one lasts a whole half hour, and I didn't want to show it. And he interviews the girl for a half hour, and they explain about the priest. He left, and she fell in love with him, and all this, you know. So that was what they're talking about. And you know, he just packed up and left. So you know.
She left out the schizophrenia before?
I think so. And this probably added. You see, now as for the timing, I'm not sure if she became schizophrenic after or before. It's a good question. I don't know the case thoroughly. You know, what I have been getting is just these tidbits of his information. I've had some of these videos at home, and you know, occasionally I look at them now more than before, and I don't know the history of these. I imagine if we did research, we could find out. And by the way, when my father wrote in the book Interpretation of Schizophrenia, he might have mentioned her because he mentions all the patients only by first names, of course, you know. But anyway, it could have been, there is a Marie, I think, in the book, or Laura, and he does mention those, and I don't know if that's the same Marie or not, but This lasts for another 2 or 3 minutes. You want to watch it? Yeah? Okay. And so this gives you an idea about how he works. And I'm glad we got the microphone working.
And she was able to communicate with me. I felt that there was immediately a good sense of relatedness. We could communicate. We could talk to each other without fear, without hesitation, without embarrassment. And I was the first person to whom she revealed.
Can I ask, how long did it take from your first contact with her until she actually began to speak verbally? I mean, she was speaking in her still state, you know, in her nonverbal state. But how long before she actually began to talk?
The acute catatonic state lasted about 2 weeks. After that, she was still abnormal in her movements. She had a peculiar gait.
Can you share with us how often you saw her during that period?
Yes, I saw her about 4 times a week.
And for how long?
But just for a few weeks. This was an acute attack, and there was then I have continued to see her for 3, and now for 2 a week. I continue to see. So there was a dramatic improvement as far as the catatonic attack was concerned, but there was a flourishing of paranoid ideation, and the idea of this vampire was dominant in her mind, that this man was a vampire, and maybe she too would become
Yeah, she thought the priest was a vampire. Really, she thought, no joke.
When I first saw her, she was absolutely sure that Donald was a vampire. When the catatonic attack succeeded, the paranoid ideation flourished. She was absolutely sure that Donald was a vampire, and she was afraid that maybe she herself would become one. But as soon as we were able to communicate, a little doubt entered into her mind. My technique was the following: to tell her he had been like a vampire, and this she gradually accepted. In other words, there was a period during which I helped her not to lose completely the delusion, but to transform the delusion into a metaphor, and to recognize actually that her primary process had built this metaphor is similar to the process that the poet uses when he makes a metaphor. The poet says, or would have said immediately, is like a vampire. But with the psychotic, there is no such a process. For the psychotic, that person was a vampire, so we have to transform the psychotic into a poet before he or she becomes a normal or
it's an image of taken for reality.
Human being, yes. This primary process of thinking is not so bizarre or so irrational, has a rationality of its own. The rationality of the poet is very, very close to a certain experiential truth, because really Marie, although she loved very much this man, and she knew, or a part of her knew, that this relation should not exist, that it was a betrayal of her principle. She was being used. She was being used by a person whom she had trusted, the person that she had trusted the most in her whole life. Because I have not mentioned, we didn't have the the time. He had to discuss her past, her childhood, her adolescence, to discuss how really her family climate and everything which preceded the acute episode predisposed or prepared the ground for this acute attack. She was ready.
That her illness is not genetic, it's not hereditary, that has something to do with environment, family, culture, background?
Well, if there is a genetic element, is secondary, in my opinion. Perhaps is necessary, but not at all sufficient to determine this condition. So what I was saying is that she was ready for a relation which would possess her entirely or disrupt her entirely, and the treatment saved her from a complete disruption, and she was able to re-emerge.
Okay, so anyway, that gave you an idea. Now, if anybody wants to get in touch with me, I gave business cards, take them, and then you can contact me, and if you need any more information, I'll be happy to get in touch with you. I give all my home phone numbers, pager, everything. As I tell my students in class, I give them all my information. So if President Obama wanted to get a hold of me, there's no other way other than what I give you all. Now, let's do the raffle here.
David, what an intense man he was. Was I the only one who perceived it? I don't think I was. Was he like that in everyday life?
Oh, yeah.
If it's not...
No, I'm glad you asked me that. First of all, many of you are going to wonder what type of father was he, okay? And I'll explain to you. I thought he was very good, even though he was working a lot. I remember as a young kid when on weekends, this is something I also wanted to mention to you because maybe you feel that he was too busy to deal with his family. I feel honored for other reasons. I remember on weekends, he would take my brother and myself to the movies, and he would sit between us and he would explain what's going on and stuff like this. He would take us to places, you know, for entertainment and things. So I believe he was a very good father. And, you know, through high school, you know, we had a normal life, and I felt very honored because, you know, we grew up in New York City. I lived in Manhattan, and most of the time when I was in high school, we lived on 90th Street and Broadway. You know, everybody knows what streets above 90th and below here. Here in Chicago, you got names, you know. But anyway, it was, so he was a very good father, and, you know, we'd always go places, and plus we went to Europe a few times by boat. And so I feel honored, and I appreciate this. And wait, there was one other thing I wanted to tell you that, yeah, we never needed, you know, he made, you know, he wasn't a millionaire, but we never did without, you know, and I was lucky to, let's say, be his son, you might say. And I was pleased that he was an excellent father. As far as I remember, you know, before I went away to college, I mean, you know, we had a normal life. Nothing unusual, and he would be with us all the time, despite the fact he would work. So he would come home late. That's a big deal. You know, it didn't bother me in the least. He would come home and, you know, do what the normal father does. And I know that was something I wanted to tell you because, like I say, you hear about stories about famous people, they ignore their families, but I feel honored, and I like to share it. Yes. Anyway, are there any other questions? I'll be happy to answer. Yes. And feel free, by the way, to contact me. You know, I enjoy being contacted. Yes.
Actually, I want to make you feel good. I used to work at the Elgin Mental Health Center, which in the 60s, especially 50s and 60s, was an experimental, the nation's experimental humanistic psychology and psychiatry site.
Right.
And your father's name was mentioned like one of the gods.
Oh.
I know that he consulted us. I came later, you know, after Elgin became just a hospital. But at the time, with his influence, they turned the whole grounds into a community in which psychiatrists and patients would live together there was a big farm, workshops, and people would, the patients would work and live on it, kind of a full life. And the therapists would too. It was closed because one of the psychiatrists was caught, I think, employing some of the patients for a private thing at home, and the union made a big deal of it. But at the time, humanistic psychology, which was the type that your father is writing about and practicing, was the big thing, and it really influenced psychologists to no avail. So when I heard his name, I said, I have to come here.
Oh, good. Hey, do you think his methods work, or his ideas?
Absolutely. It's. I think your father is sophisticated enough to not take all the credit and say there is no genetic basis.
Yeah.
Today we know more due to fMRI,
Yeah.
the technology that didn't exist at the time. We know that the schizophrenic brain is different. However, the whole schizophrenia is explained as a 2x2, where environmental triggers will trigger or not something genetic, something.
I have a question for you. Now, these days they use a lot of medication. Now, here's the question I have. I always ask psychiatrists, people in the field, my father especially, I don't think he was too much into giving drugs. He was more on psychotherapy. Now, my question is, these days I think they're finding that it's more organic instead of functional, which means there's some metabolic problem, chemistry problem in the brain. And so this is my question, does psychotherapy actually help by talking, or do you need in combination with the medicines?
Combination works, but they say that medication can help about 50%. What it helps is the symptoms, the hallucination and delusions, which means the person can come back to reality. But all the effect on the personality of living under the condition of the certain reality of delusion change the personality such that one absolutely needs psychotherapy.
So that really helps.
Oh yeah, that's...
And the reason why I'm so happy to hear that, because I was worried that his ideas were outdated now, because don't forget this was written in the 70s, so they're still useful today.
Absolutely.
This was something I always wondered about, and I'm happy to hear it, because we're always advancing. Yes?
This doesn't have to do with your father, it has to do with you.
Yeah, go ahead.
I remember reading years ago when Claire Bluth, who was made the ambassador of Italy,
right.
She continued to get sick. She lived in this kind of palatial place, and she continued to get sick, and she continued to get sick. They finally discovered that there was something from the paint on the ceiling
I was just going to
where
say
she
that.
lived. Yes. Is there anything, are people studying something
Yes,
like
as
that?
a matter of fact,
I'm wondering about...
I'm glad you mentioned that. There was something that I didn't give to Andre in the introduction. All right, I'll see you. Take care. Okay, there's one of my students. I'm a member of the American Academy of Environmental Medicine. I've been a member since 1989. Even though I'm not a doctor, I'm an associate member because my field is environmental science and health associated with this. And this organization is actually set up for people like you're describing. Let me explain. What's your first name?
Mary.
So what Mary's talking about, this person, I was getting sick. Now she was suffering from this lady, what you call tight building syndrome, which means, and you see this a lot, especially in the buildings here in Chicago. Why Chicago? Because the tall buildings, notice I bet there's not one building where you can open the windows, right?
Right.
So what happens? Okay, as I mentioned earlier, well, I don't know if I did, I mentioned about carpets. Well, new carpets, they gas off, especially the new ones. They have all sorts of stuff on them. They have colors, they have easy stuff to clean, so they put it on to make it easier to clean. In the case of clothes, you have this, they put this, permanent press stuff, and they have colors. They have all these things which gas off, and they make people sick. And that's especially true in new homes. I'm sure at least a few of you have moved into a very brand new home, was just built, was just freshly painted, right? Your eyes water, your throat, you know, you feel lousy because the paint's gassing off. And by the way, just a word of advice for those who want to live in a brand new house, as soon as it's built, don't move into it for 2 weeks and leave the windows open. Go somewhere else because it'll gas out off. That's what you need. So anyway, yeah, she suffered from tight building sickness, or the other name is called multiple chemical sensitivity. She's responding to all these.
This was in Italy.
Yeah, it could be anywhere. Now, let me tell you why. Now, what by the way, the doctors who deal with this are called clinical ecologists. Most of them were allergists. And this has to do with psychiatry, because, you know, I've been a member for over 20 years, and when a patient would go to a regular doctor, the doctor says it's all in your head and they'll send you to a psychiatrist. That actually happened. No, it did, you see? But it's not. It's real, because everybody reacts differently. You know, you heard of a woman. Now, I used to be involved with Dr. Randolph. I got acquainted with him. He was one of the experts, the founders of this association, because somehow I got involved. Everything's luck. You know, I meet people who tell me about him. I actually met a young girl at a science fair where I was judging, and she was telling me about her aunt who suffered real bad. She would be allergic to tomatoes. Even the foam, the plastic on the phone would make her ears swell up, not because somebody was yelling at her, because of the plastic. So anyway, so then she told me the name of somebody, and I got involved. I called up the doctor, and one thing led to another. So I actually have videos of me interviewing this doctor and stuff about all these issues. So these are real issues. And that lady, Mary, that you were talking about, I don't know if she's still alive, do you know?
No, Claire Blue Cruz. Her husband at one time was the editor of Time magazine, Time and Life.
Oh, okay.
Years ago, I think it was in the 50s.
By the way, even newspaper ink. Plus, when you read the news, it makes you sick. But by smelling it, and if, you know, hot off the press, you get sick from the